Welcome to Season 2 of the Hidden Philanthropist podcast, proudly presented by the Purdy Foundation. Join us as we uncover the art of giving back.
Listeners, if you haven't read any of Hugh Mackay's books, watched him give keynote addresses, or heard him on radio discussing his views on social anthropology, I hope this inspiring conversation will spur you on to learn more about this great man and his brilliant mind. His grasp on issues that face humankind initiate debate, and at the core of it all, his mantra is all about truly listening so that others are heard, and that kindness can help cure all. You're an Australian psychologist, a 60-year career as a social researcher, a best-selling author. You're the patron of the Asylum Seekers Centre. In recognition of your pioneering work in social research, you've been elected a Fellow of the Australian Psychological Society, and awarded honorary doctorates by Charles Sturt, Macquarie, New South Wales, Western Sydney and Wollongong universities. You have numerous honorary degrees and awards and numerous honorary professions. You've been delivered numerous significant addresses, and you've delivered numerous significant addresses and lectures, and you're appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia Medal in 2015.
Yep. Yes, no medal, just Order of Australia.
Order of Australia.
Yes, Officer of the Order of Australia.
You appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2015. As a social psychologist and best-selling author of 23 books, including The Therapist and your previous book, which I'm mesmerised by, and we're here to talk about today, The Kindness Revolution. Welcome to the Hidden Philanthropist, Hugh Mackay.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Great pleasure to meet you and talk to you.
Was that a nicer introduction than Yoda of Australian literature or Wise Elder that I've heard before?
This is one of the most disconcerting things that gets said to me. I'm speaking at an event promoting a book, and some lovely young person comes up to me and I think this is going to be a compliment, and they say, "My grandmother loves your work."
Well, I guess it's a backhanded compliment. Well, it's still a compliment, isn't it?
It is a compliment, yes.
At least you're being recognised for your incredible work. Hugh, my podcast, The Hidden Philanthropist, is about trying to stimulate introspection of one's kindness and compassion. So I feel a real honour and a privilege to be talking to you today about the kindness revolution. It's a book that discusses the fact that revolutions never start at the top. If we dare to dream of a more loving country, kinder, more compassionate, more cooperative, more respectful, more inclusive, more harmonious and a less cynical society, then there's one way to start turning that dream into reality. Each of us must live as if this already exists in our country. It talks about how we can restore hope, rebuild trust and inspire optimism. It's a remarkable book. I find it incredible that you mentioned that this book is a distillation of, I think you said, 30 years of research. You talk about how kindness, compassion and connectedness are inherent to human nature. Since we're a social species, we're built for cooperation, you talk about. It talks about how recent social trends have been pushing us away from our true nature in a different direction of rampant individualism and competitiveness. It talks about our value of neighbourhood in the sense that we experience in crisis, which incredibly you started writing this book before COVID.
Yes.
Which is amazing, isn't it? Because you've started this book about this concept, and then here we are. We find ourselves in the middle of the COVID crisis.
And it's interesting, the COVID crisis, because remember it came on the heels of unprecedented bushfires, floods, and then COVID, and now more floods. And a crisis, a catastrophe like that, whether it's a health, a pandemic or a depression or fires, floods, etc., always has the effect of bringing out the best in us. It's a fascinating thing about human nature, but we can drift away from our true nature as members of a social species. I mean, that's the starting point for any conversation about human behaviour, Andrew, just to remind ourselves that we belong to a social species, and what that means is we are hopeless in isolation. When we cut ourselves off from the human herd that we're really part of, we suffer. We absolutely need connectedness. We need groups, communities, herds, families, neighbourhoods, work colleagues. That's what absolutely fundamental to our mental and emotional health. But we can drift away from it, as you said in your intro just now. Our society has been, not just us by the way, Western society, has been through a very weird half century, particularly the last 30 or 40 years. All sorts of social changes like shrinking households, high rate of relationship breakdown, more mobility, more busyness, everyone rushing about, and of course our enthusiastic embrace of information technology, which is brilliant, but does tend to keep us apart from each other. There's a whole lot of changes like that, which have had the cumulative effect of breaking down some of our social cohesion, making us a more fragmented kind of society, which has led, as you said very correctly a moment ago, has led to the rise of really a rampant individualism, a more competitive society in which people, I think the really interesting sign of this is how obsessed people had become with their own personal identity, how different, unique, special I am, how I'm different from you. It's all about my particular point on the gender spectrum, or my ethnicity, or my religion, or my politics, or my cultural preferences, or something about me that makes me unique. Now, that's all important and it's all interesting. A person's gender, a person's ethnicity, it's all interesting. But it pales into insignificance compared with the deepest truth about us, which is that we share a common humanity. The most important thing about you and me is not the different journeys we've been on or what our ethnic background might be or anything. The most important thing about you and me is we're both humans. And once we get that we belong to a species that has actually survived only on this planet because alone among the 5 human species that previously roamed the planet, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, etc., Homo sapiens is the only one that survived because archaeologists now tell us we're the only species that learned to cooperate. And I read about that in an article that was called Survival of the Kindest, because what they were saying is the nature of Homo sapiens, the nature of our particular species of human is to be cooperative, to build. We've known, it's sort of almost in our tribal memory, that we can only survive if we cooperate. And so it's in our DNA. Neuroscientists now say to us they can find the cooperative centre in the brain. They can't find the competitive centre, Andrew.
We're going to talk about that.
We learn to compete, but our nature is to cooperate. And that means we are equipped from birth with the capacity for kindness, compassion, mutual respect, tolerance, inclusiveness, all those lovely things. They don't all get developed in all of us, but the capacity is in all of us. Sorry, I went on a bit.
No. What I was about to say, we're here today to talk about the book, The Kindness Revolution. And you talked then about some of these things that neuroscientists have found now with a whole range of different things, and I want to get to that because I think once we get into this book and some of your theories in the book, where it's going to be a really fascinating conversation. And I know we are here to talk about the book. It would be remiss of me quickly, though, if it's okay with you, to talk about just a small snippet, a small part of the journey that's got you to where you are today. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure.
Because I would love to. You've got this wonderful mind, these beautiful theories, and we'll talk about that in the book. Leading up to here, what was life like for a young Hugh?
The young Hugh was lazy at school, brought up in a very sort of fundamentalist religious household, very devout church-going parents, which was very influential on my young life, although I moved away from that. But when I left school, Andrew, I can actually remember the day I walked out the school gate thinking, wonder what I'm going to do. I really had no clear sense of direction at all. I had a part-time holiday job in a department store straight after school. But my father, who was in advertising, had heard of this is the year I finished school was 1954. It's ancient history.
Sydney Grammar School?
Sydney Grammar, yeah. My father had heard of this sort of embryonic industry, public opinion research, market research, media research, etc. He thought this might be quite interesting to young Hugh, because I was a bit of an introverted kid. I mean, a keen reader, much more interested in observing. I remember at school spending a lot of time in the school library just looking out the window at the other kids playing in the playground. I wasn't antisocial, but I always loved being the observer. So I got a job, age 16, straight out of school. I got a job in a public opinion research company. There were only 3 such companies in Australia at the time. And it was like magic for me. I mean, from the moment I started in that, I thought, gee, you can make a living out of observing what people do and understanding people's attitudes and behaviour and all that stuff. So even though I was just a kid, and this is pre-computers, pre-television, but I could see what a fascinating job it would be to study society, whether through commercial research, why people buy a particular brand of car or washing powder or whatever it might be, or media research, why they choose to listen to and subsequently watch particular programs and so on, or more general social research, how people feel about politics or raising kids or buying a house or whatever it might be. So I spent 4 years in that company. I then had a wild year away, thinking that I might like to be a school teacher. I mean, I don't know why I did that, but
meeting you today, I'm not sure that you and wild go hand in glove, do they, Hugh? Is there something you can shed light on for us?
Well, it was wild in the sense it was completely off direction. I went to a boarding school in regional Queensland, and for a year I taught English, mathematics, history, logic, bookkeeping. I was the choir master, the librarian, a sports coach, a resident housemaster. Nearly killed me. And then I rushed back to Sydney and back into the research business after that. So I went to the ABC, worked in their audience research department. From there I went to establish a company that was owned by an advertising agency, but it was a company designed to do communication research with obvious commercial benefit for the clients of the company that owned us. But that's where I started to develop an interest more broadly than just commercial research into, and it started at the ABC, into more general social research. So in 1971, I started my own business. And my aim was always to try and find a way of conducting broad social research on broad themes about society that would be funded by, I wasn't sure how it was going to be funded, but it ended up being funded by mainly commercial organisations, media companies, commercial marketing companies and so on, paying an annual subscription which funded this program that was called the Mackay Report, very modestly. And 4 times a year we would produce a report on some aspect of the Australian way of life. So we developed, over 25 years. It was then sold to an international research company and it fizzled out, unfortunately. But in those 25 years, we produced over 100 reports on the Australian way of life, which are lodged in various libraries around the place, and some commercial organisations have probably still got the full set. But it was unique at the time, and it was commercially successful. But the other thing was that it led me to become so deeply immersed in how Australians think and what's happening to this society and so on, that a publisher finally approached me, because I used to do a lot of public speaking about the results of this research. A publisher finally approached me and said, you should put all this in a book. So in 1993, by which time I was already in my mid-50s, I wrote my first book, which was called Reinventing Australia. And that was very successful. The success of that took the publisher by surprise, certainly took me by surprise, but it just made me realise how hungry people were for a mirror to be held up to them, to understand themselves a bit better, because it was a very turbulent period. I mean, it was the beginning of a very turbulent period in our social evolution. A lot of people, anxiety levels were rising, depression was becoming a more common form of mental illness. We were starting to fragment more as a society, and a lot of people were troubled but didn't know why they were troubled. And so that book, I don't think it's overstating, so it was a comfort to a lot of people to read what was happening generally. And then, and a lot of people said to me after they'd read that book, "Oh, I didn't know you were, hiding in our kitchen or under our bed. You seem to have understood our family," which, for a social researcher is the greatest compliment anyone can pay you.
Were you surprised with the reaction that you got from the... I was,
but I subsequently realised that this was because they were going through all the things that I was writing about, and they needed someone to lay it all out for them. So that's when people started saying about me something which I really like being said, because it is the greatest compliment you can pay a researcher, which is, this is the bloke who explains us to ourselves. That's the height of my ambition, to explain people to themselves.
So it's interesting that you mentioned before, you're deeply immersed into this research, and your work show that you are an incredibly deep thinker. It's interesting that even as a child you were an introvert, and you sat back and watched, and you're obviously clearly a very much a processor of what goes on around you. So it started at a young age. Were your parents academics?
No, not at all. No, my mother was a stay-at-home mum for most of my childhood, and then my father ran into some terrible commercial trouble, which caused the family to have a bit of a financial disaster, so she went back to work. He was in advertising, and she worked as a secretary. And no one in my extended family had ever been to university, so I was one of those kids who was the first in the family. And when I left school, I didn't even know where Sydney University was, and it was only when I started that job that my boss said, "By the way, you'll need to go to university." So I was an evening student. If I have any regrets about my life, Andrew, it probably is that I never had a year, not even 1 year, of being a full-time student. It was always an evening student, which was a tough gig, and not as satisfactory an experience as the people who are able to just focus entirely on their academic work.
You answered probably my final question about what I was going to say is your insight into human behaviour brings with it a wonderful way of studying, interpreting, analysing and summing up social interactions and motivations. And I was going to talk about your journey into social anthropology. I guess we touched on that really. 1971, you went out and you went into your own business. You started writing pieces and you did your first book. So I guess that there sums up your initial journey into your professional life in social anthropology.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd like to say about that is that I was, from the time I was at the ABC through to when I started my own business and developed it further, I was very interested in qualitative research. I was trained in statistical research and normal, questionnaire-based surveys and count up the answers and get the statistics, which is all terrific. But I realised that a whole lot of what we really want to know about what makes people tick and why they make the decisions they make and how they really feel about what's happening in their lives is not quantifiable. You can investigate it, but you can't measure it. And so I was one of the early users of unstructured very conversational, personal interviews, like the conversation we're having now. If you're the researcher, your approach is very much like my approach. Get someone talking. Say as little as possible. Let them tell you their whole story. And that evolved into the use of small groups as well. I started thinking, well, there are something, wouldn't it be terrific to just listen in to a conversation between people who know each other, people who are friends or colleagues or neighbours. So I developed this idea of going into people's homes, getting them to assemble a group of just 5 or 6 of their friends, give them a topic, and let them run. And I was just like, and my colleagues who were working with me, just like a fly on the wall. For 60 or 90 minutes, you wouldn't say a single word. They'd just be talking about politics or raising kids or whatever the subject of our particular study was. And that became my favoured research method, the unstructured conversational interview and the unstructured, non-directed small group discussion. It's an absolute, it's very labour intensive, it's very hard to analyse the data, but it's an absolute gold mine.
And we're going to touch on this a bit later, but it's amazing you sat there and listened. Pretty incredible things happen when you sit and listen, don't they?
They do. And that's a lesson for all of us, Andrew. I think one of the reasons why in Australia in 2023 there is such strong demand for psychotherapy, and why 30% of psychotherapists around Australia have closed their books, they're just overworked, they can't take on anymore, is that we have lost the art of listening to each other. Listening is one of the most valuable things we do for each other. It's therapeutic to be listened to, it's a gift. And of course, when you're the listener, you're learning something which I regard as one of the deepest truths about human beings, which is they are all interesting. Sometimes, he's such a boring person. No, he's not. You just haven't listened. Listen, just do what you're doing, get him talking, and everybody's story is interesting. And everybody walks with shadows, everybody carries tragedies, everybody's got unfulfilled hopes, everyone's had disappointments and all that stuff. And it all comes out when you let people listen, and that's good for them, and it's good for the health of our society. It helps to build social... if you said to me, what's the purpose of being here? What's the purpose of our life on planet Earth as humans? I'd say it's to build and maintain social harmony, because that's how our species will... We reproduce, sure, in a biological sense, but we've got to build social harmony, and the crucial ingredient in that is listening respectfully, empathically, attentively to each other. We've all become so busy, so impatient, we're losing the art of listening, and people are having to go off and pay a therapist to listen to them.
We're going to touch on all of this, and I'd like to repeat myself as I did at the start of this interview by saying how incredibly grateful I am of your willingness to talk about the kindness revolution with me, because it was a really powerful book for me. And I'm not going to go through the book chronologically, chapter by chapter, but I think coming out of COVID, probably 2 chapters that resonate with a lot of people just happen to be chapter 1 and 2. And you talk about in chapter 1, I mentioned coming out of this COVID crisis, that one of our greatest assets of human nature is the inert capacity for kindness and our ability for this to rise to the surface in a crisis. And that's why I think it's important that we talk about this now coming out of COVID, and in this chapter taking the rough with the smooth, chapter 1, when we are down, kindness prevails, and we are hardwired for cooperation. And the discovery of you mentioned before, the discovery of the cooperative centre in the brain by neuroscientists. Chapter 1, I'd love you to talk to us about what it's all about.
Yeah, well, this is a point we just briefly touched on, but I think it's worth developing a bit. When we get carried away with our own ego-driven agenda, when we think pleasing ourselves is the most important thing, and we lose sight of the fact that we are members of a cooperative species, that our neighbours are our neighbours and they need us, that our friendships need to be nurtured, all that sort of stuff. When we lose sight of that, we become very unhealthy. And then when there's a shock, like COVID is a classic case because we all know about it. I mean, my parents' generation lived through crisis after crisis. World War I, Spanish flu, Great Depression, World War II. But before COVID, we had a sort of a dream period, 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth, which we all thought was wonderful. And in many ways it was wonderful. But actually, emotionally, psychologically, it was bad for us, because it lulled us into this sense that it was okay just to pursue a materialist agenda and an individualistic agenda. Everything was going to be fine, and we started neglecting, for example, the neighbourhood. In cities like Sydney and Melbourne, I used to be shocked at the number of people I would encounter in research who just say we don't know our neighbours. They didn't say that happily. They said it wistfully, as probably it's a bit weird that we don't know, and after all we live next door, but that's the kind of society we were becoming. Now COVID shocked us out of that. Suddenly people thought, wow, it was a lockdown. That old guy at the end of the street, I haven't seen him around. I wonder if he needs a hand. Maybe I can pick up a prescription for him, or when I'm going to the supermarket I could do his shopping, or whatever it might be. All over Australia, we heard, I'm sure you heard, hundreds and hundreds of stories of little local neighbourhoods that were revived by the experience of living through COVID. Now, what that's about, the same thing happens in a town that's ravaged by a fire or a flood. People don't just sort of fold their arms and say, well, this is hopeless. They pitch in. In Brisbane, the last major flood in Brisbane, people came from all over the place, busloads of them, total strangers with brooms and buckets and mops and everything to help other people clean up. That's what we do. That's not heroic. That's not, well, I suppose it's remarkable in a way, but it's not exceptional. That's humans being truly human. What Abraham Lincoln described as the better angels of our nature. The better angels of our nature always swing into action when there's a crisis. So we saw that in COVID. There's a Melbourne research company called the Scanlon Foundation, who for years have been tracking social cohesion and the sense of belonging. And they've been tracking a very steady decline in those things over many years, but a reversal of that trend during COVID. Because that's what happens to humans when we're shocked by a crisis, or even, a life-threatening illness in an individual's life, or some other catastrophe that befalls us. It reminds us. It's almost as though nature's saying to us, hang on, don't forget, you're human.
Was COVID a crisis?
It was. It doesn't look like it now. And in fact, that research I referred to shows that the graph is starting to go down again.
The reason I asked it was very much a loaded question. We wonder, you talk about the crises of the past that have created permanent change, and we talk about COVID being a crisis, and it was certainly a terribly hard time for a lot of people. But I wonder the change, and I'm talking specifically now to this sense of neighbourhood and going out and helping people in our immediate community, and the change that it did bring in COVID, and it absolutely did bring change. Is it permanent change?
It looks, I hate saying this. I wish I could just say unequivocally yes, but it looks as though we're slipping back. It's a very interesting thing. In terms of global health, an expert on COVID recently announced that Australia is now the global hotspot for COVID. Australia has, per capita, the highest death rate from COVID in the world, but we're just ignoring it now. It's still raging, but you don't hear anything on the news anymore. Politicians never refer to it, and we're all behaving as if it's not happening, but people are still getting sick and dying from it. It's as though we decided, no, we don't, we've had enough of this. Let's get back. People would say, let's get back to normal. Now, what normal meant was a situation where we didn't nurture our relationships with neighbours, a situation where we were a bit selfish, a bit intent on our own agenda. Do we really want to go, too busy to pay attention to what other people might need from us?
We're supposed to be busy, aren't we?
Do we? Well, I'm suggesting busyness is the great enemy of social cohesion. You know, it's interesting you put it like that, Andrew. We're supposed to be busy. I mean, in Australia, we now greet. It's typical for people to greet each other by saying, "How are you going, Andrew? Busy?" As though, come on, you know, is the switch on or off? You know, are you busy or are you dead? As though busy is normal, whereas busy is weird when you think about it. Busy means I'm so caught up with activity that, it's very self-absorbed. It's like a little bubble. You know, the neighbours are having drinks on Friday night. Oh, sorry, too busy. You know, don't disturb Dad, he's busy.
It's an easy excuse, isn't it, for a lot of things?
It sounds like a virtue, busy. Must be important, he's so busy. Well, I think we've got to look in the mirror about busyness and say, hang on, are we running too hard? Are we getting caught up on this treadmill of busyness as some sort of escape? Is it a hiding place for us? We're not willing to engage, to play our role as neighbours, friends, family members, etc. I think it's a bit of a warning to us.
Too busy to retain that sense of neighbourhood that we learnt really quickly in COVID.
Yeah. We've mentioned kindness a couple of times. I think it's important to say one thing about kindness in the context of what we're talking about our true humanity. I think of kindness as a unique form of human love. All forms of human love are wonderful. You know, romantic love is exciting, energizing. Familial love is powerful. Companionate love, where would we be without the affection of our friends and so on? That's all terrific. And when we say things like, I love chocolate, I love dogs, I love that movie, I love this book, I love your hair, we're talking about an emotional response. We're talking about affection. But there's this one form of love, kindness. I mean, the original word was loving kindness. We've chopped it back to kindness, which does not involve the emotions at all. I think it's really important to remind ourselves about this regularly. One of the loveliest things about being human is that we have the capacity to be kind to people we don't like. It's nothing to do with liking people. We have the capacity to be kind to people we could never agree with. Even the capacity to be kind to total strangers. Isn't that a great species to belong to?
You often reference a Samuel Johnson quote, don't you?
Yes, I love that quote. Kindness is in our power, even when fondness is not. Let's remember that.
Sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's natural for us to be kind to each other because that builds the social harmony that's good for all of us, you know. And we are. I mean, if you see someone in a jam, it's a rainy day, there's someone, they've been carrying a plastic shopping bag that's split. The shopping's gone all over the place. You don't say to them, look, I see you're in a bit of a jam there. Before I offer to help, a couple of questions. How did you vote in the last election? Do you believe that Jesus rose bodily from the dead? I've got some boxes here we have to tick to see if you're qualified for me to be kind. That's not what you do. It
sounds crazy, doesn't it, when you put it like that?
Of course. There's someone in need, you just help them. There's a kid in trouble in the water and you're fully clothed on the wharf, but you just jump in. That's not heroic, that's human. What would be weird would be not to jump in, not to help that person. Yeah, it's kindness at work. Think. I mean, if people took away nothing else from our conversation, I'd love them to get hold of this idea that kindness is the truly human way of being in the world. Just think of kindness as being like breathing. We can't flourish if we don't breathe, and we can't flourish as humans. Our personalities can't flourish if we don't just be kind daily to everyone. No qualifications. My next door neighbour, let's say, is a rabid right-winger, so we just never discuss politics because it's too awkward. But I can still be kind. He can still be kind to me. It's nothing to do with agreeing or liking. Let's split off kindness from all the other forms of love. This is the one that does not. I mean, it might engage the emotions, but it doesn't need to. Kindness is a response to another human being because they're human, not because of any particular need that we approve of.
It's a really, really basic fundamental that if we reverted back to, society would be a very different place.
Yeah, well, and it's relevant to the whole philanthropy thing as well, Andrew, because what we're saying is, for example, and I know you're involved in this kind of thing, so I'm preaching to the converted, but we don't help the poor because they're in some way qualifying, because we think they're particularly deserving or they've indicated something that we approve of. We help the poor because they're poor. A society like ours should be ashamed of poverty, should be ashamed of homelessness. We address those things, preferably through government action, but there's usually not enough of it, so we address those things through philanthropy. And that's philanthropists being truly human, not being heroic, just being human. I've got the money, this person hasn't, they need support, not because they're qualified for it, just because they're in trouble. The poor deserve our attention because they're poor. The homeless deserve a roof over their head because they're homeless. Finland do it. Australia could do it.
We don't do enough of it.
No, because for various reasons we've lost sight of kindness as our core quality as human, the thing that actually makes us flourish, allows us to flourish, and does build social harmony. We're very good at wringing our hands and complaining about the state of society. I don't think any of us is qualified to complain about the state of society unless we are, in the way you described in the stuff that you read at the beginning, unless we are living in our own family, in our own workplace, in our own street, in our own neighbourhood, unless we are living a life of kindness and compassion and inclusion and tolerance and all those things, all the things we hope would happen in the big picture, we've got to make them happen in the miniatures of our own lives.
We do. Talking about Samuel Johnson's quote before, this is probably one that resonates with you more, and that's a Carl Rogers quote. Listening is one of the most courageous acts because if we are truly listening to others, we run the risk of changing our mind.
Yeah.
Chapter 2 of the book. Yeah. Everyone's deepest need is to be heard.
Yeah. I love Carl Rogers. He's now dead. He once came to, he's an American psychotherapist. He founded a whole school of psychotherapy, which inspired my approach to research, by the way. He started the so-called encounter group of people talking through their problems with each other with a therapist present. He's a bit of a hero of mine. But it's very interesting that he uses the word courage when he talks about listening, because it is a courageous act for the reason that he says. All of us, we're all, how can I put this, we're all in a way prisoners of our own experience. From a very early age, we've begun putting together Andrew's view of the world, Hugh's view of the world, based on what our family experience is like, our school experience, our neighbourhood experience. We gradually build up a kind of a worldview. And I think of that, some people don't like this term, but I think of that as a mind cage. And from inside the mind cage, we feel very secure with our own values, our own attitudes, our own beliefs, etc. The problem is, from inside our mind cage, we don't see the world exactly as it is. We see it filtered through the bars of our own cages. Selective perception, psychologists talk about selective listening, selective memory. We choose the bits that allow us to remain comfortable in this secure little cage that we've built. Now, if we're going to really, and this is Carl Rogers' point, and I support it 110%, if we're going to really listen to someone, what that means is we're going to actually entertain their ideas. We're not necessarily going to agree with them. Once we've entertained their ideas and fully absorbed what they're saying, we might then have a knockdown, drag-out argument with them. That's fine. But I'm not qualified to argue with you until I've really understood your point of view. Now, to really understand your point of view, I have to listen so attentively that I need to step outside the comfort and security of my own cage, and that's courageous. That's risky, because what happens if I move outside that? I'm no longer filtering. I'm trying to be you. I'm trying to imagine what it's like to walk in your shoes. It's like trying on a coat. Try on that coat. No, that wouldn't suit me. It's not my kind of coat. It's not the right size. How do you know? You haven't tried it on. Try it on, then decide. Well, that's what listening is. Trying on the coat, trying on someone else's point of view as if you are them. And Carl Rogers says, here's the risk. You might have to change your mind.
Scary to some people.
Scary stuff. Really? Change my mind? No, I'm right. My experience has taught me all this stuff. And you can see that in politics particularly. People on the right think people on the left are just nuts. People on the left think people on the right are just nuts. The challenge is for us all to be a bit more open to each other, because actually we all want a better world. We've got the same goal. We might have different ways of achieving it, but we need to listen more attentively and if you're not running the risk of being changed by what you hear, then you're not really listening. It doesn't mean you will be changed. You're just running the risk of being, you're open to it. Then by all means, scurry back into your own little cage, clang, shut the door, and process it all. But you got to go out into the cold.
Not my opinion, I'm asking yours. Are we a society that talks too much and doesn't listen enough?
Absolutely. It's a perfect summary of the problem. And it's an interesting, I love that. And it's more true now than it's been for a long time, because we've now got so used to our devices, which are all about sending messages or reading messages, but it's not about listening. It's all about transmission, projection of the self, burnishing my brand image, photoshopping my face and all that stuff. Even to the point where, it's a digression, but I can't help mentioning it, where cosmetic surgeons are saying people are coming in with their photoshopped, the image they've created of themselves on Instagram, and saying, can you fix my face to look like that?
Anti-social, social media.
Yeah. So it's very much about transmission. And I think the more we rely on these devices, the less willing we are to listen when we get into a face-to-face conversation.
Two things before we move on. One, this is a very, very simplistic way to look at it, but something that surely is common sense. Isn't listening the only way that we can truly learn about someone to connect on a deeper level?
Yeah.
Only listening?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And imagine forgetting that. Imagine letting that go. Imagine being so full of ourselves that we think what's important is for me to express what I think. Doesn't really matter what you think, as long as I get my views out there. Yeah, we can't find out how interesting people are, let alone find out what their point of view might be, until we commit ourselves to listening. When you listen to me, you are saying, without having to put it into words, I take you seriously enough to bother listening. I'm prepared to entertain your ideas. That's a hugely therapeutic experience for the person being listened to. And if you wonder how therapeutic it is, just think about what happens when you don't listen to someone, when they can see that, you're looking at the watch or gazing around the room in the hope of catching sight of someone a bit more interesting to talk to, whatever it is. The message they're getting is, sorry, I don't take you seriously enough to bother listening to what you have to say. You'd never spell that out, would you, to a partner or a child or a neighbour or a colleague?
You would never spell that out to a partner before. Let's stick on this point for 1 minute. You've got a cute story, don't you, about your mother and father, and your mother... Quickly tell us you would never tell your partner.
Yes. Well, my father was an inveterate talker, and my mother was a wonderful listener. She's the kind of woman, she'd go to the shops and then come home with 5 stories about the lives of people she'd met at the bus stop or in the shop. But we had a friend. Yeah, we had a friend staying with. I'd forgotten this story. We had a friend staying with us at one stage, and when my father was out of the room, the friend said to my mother, "How do you stand it? How do you put up with it?" Meaning, all this talking. And my mother said, "Oh, I stopped listening years ago." So her defence, I think she'd heard enough. Her defence was to just stop listening. But she kept a benign look on her face.
It's quite cute, that story. I like it. I want to move on to something because I think this is probably going to protract out to a fairly lengthy chat, and I almost want to dot point it rather than continue to go chapter to chapter. Although there was another chapter in your book that really resonated with me, and that's institutions. And institutions, as I want to talk about them today, maybe not institutions as we typically think of institutions, but I'm going to put them into that category anyway, because I'd like to almost dot point talk about them. One of them is geopolitical instability and the media hype and the fear mongering around what's going on in the world today and building and breeding fear in people. Is that killing kindness?
It does, because and it's a brilliant point to raise. It does kill kindness because it's designed to make us fearful. I mean, we are now, if you take what some politicians are saying and what some media are saying, the apparent purpose is to spook us, to make us feel afraid of the prospect of almost imminent war between China and America, that we would be caught up in on America's side and suddenly we're going to be at war with China. Now, plenty of people don't believe that, but that's now become such a big aspect of what you describe as a geopolitical agenda, the looming inevitable war between China and America and Australia's place in that makes people fearful. Now, when people are fearful, they become self-absorbed. The same as when people are anxious, they become self-absorbed. When they're depressed, they become self-absorbed. And when people become self-absorbed, their capacity for kindness is inhibited. They're so concerned about how I feel and what's going to happen to me. You notice, even in the beginning of the pandemic, when people were allegedly fighting over toilet rolls in supermarket aisles, etc., there was certainly one case filmed. I don't know how many there were in reality. When people are afraid, their initial reaction is not usually very helpful. They become very self-absorbed, a bit selfish, and then gradually those better angels of our nature take over. But when there's a relentless message about looming war, with a background of the inexorable climate change problem and the implications of that, it seems almost as though the intention is to... I mean, cynical politicians in the past have said talk of war makes people nervous, anxious, fearful, and when they feel like that, they're much more likely to stick with the government they've got. I mean, that's really cynical, but that has been a view put forward in America, in Israel, in Australia, in various parts of the world. War talk is good for a government.
It's just not good for a society.
No.
Here.
I hate saying that, but because it's not good for a society. The more fearful we become, the less we express our true nature. And as you say, kindness is the great way.
My next one was, and I don't want to tie the two in, because when I say geopolitical and the next one, the adversarial approach towards the Australian political system and what we're seeing now in our government here in Australia. How does that play a role?
Yeah, well, that's a source of, and has been ever since I've been doing research on this. It was a long time.
Seems to be getting worse.
Years. It does seem to be getting worse, and people say that. That our system is built, as you correctly said, an adversarial system. Our system is built on opposition, and that comes from the British system, which comes from the British legal system. So the way the Brits run their courts is to have two barristers who are opponents arguing against each other. Not every society does that. The French don't do it that way. Lots of other societies don't do it that way. But that's how our parliament evolved, to be like that. So you have the two sides of every argument expressed in government and opposition. Now, we've inherited that, and many Australians are now saying, surely there's a better system than that. Surely it's not healthy for democracy to create the expectation of adversarialism, that it'll all be about you put it up and I'll knock it down. We'll have an election, the winner becomes the government and they've got all the power and no one else's opinion matters, all that stuff. I mean, if Australians could waive, generally speaking, Pollies don't necessarily agree with this, but generally speaking, if Australians could wave a magic wand over our democracy, they would radically change the way our parliaments work and get away from the idea of an adversarial process.
It's got to the point, Hugh, where it's that crazy now. You talked about you put it up and we'll pull it down. It's got to the point now where you put it up, we'll argue in a public domain against you for putting it up, but then when we get into power, we'll take the credit for putting it up, hasn't it?
Yeah, and that's an example of how nonsensical it can become.
Yep.
Because it's almost as, I mean, if you wonder if they're playing a game, take a look at Question Time in the House of Representatives. They are playing a game. It's an adversarial game, and it's a tragedy that almost every day the Parliament sits, we see this circus carrying on. Very, very unproductive, very unhelpful, and very bad for the contestants, the players, because it cements this idea that we're at each other's throats.
And it's scary to think that these people are creating the framework for our education system, where we're bringing through the next generation of young people to learn about how society works, and it's coming from the top where they're prepared to play these games. It's almost
well,
crazy.
Parents, teachers who take kids into the gallery of Parliament houses, federal or state, often say the behaviour of politicians in Question Time is worse than the kids in the playground. We wouldn't let our kids behave like that towards each other.
It's almost crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
The next institution that I want to talk about, and again, for me, it's something that's probably more prevalent is the institution of corporation, the way that corporates have changed the way that we live post-COVID, because COVID changed so much. We've gone from boardroom meetings to webinars. We've gone from interviews to Zoom meetings.
Yes.
We've gone from working as a team, in a team environment, to encouraging people to work from home. I mean, corporations changed a huge amount, hasn't it?
It has.
In post-COVID, in how we go about. And I think that has a massive impact on people's mental health and to break it right down, their ability for kindness. I mean, we're trained to almost live in a selfish environment now.
Yeah, this is one of the very unfortunate effects of COVID. There were some very good effects, and some of those effects I think will linger, but one of the unfortunate ones is it's become so easy to stay in your own little bubble and just be connected via social media or Zoom or Teams or whatever corporate link you're using. And we all know that is radically different from being face-to-face. You and I are having a conversation now which is a proper human conversation. You have expressions on your face, you smile or you frown, and I pick all that up. I pick up your body language. That's how humans interact. The words, some of the people who've tried to study human communication and the role of the words say, well, the role of the words is very important, but the role of all the other things, the tone of voice, the rate of speech, the posture, the gestures, the facial expressions, the ambience of where we're meeting and so on, all of those things are often even more important than the words. And we know that, someone can with a red face and a shaking fist say, look, I'm not angry with you. And they're obviously angry, but the words contradict it. So you take notice of everything but the words and say, this bloke is angry. And a funny thing about him is he's saying he's not angry. So there's a whole shift that you've just described in which we are really being encouraged to work from home, which is very convenient. You can work in your tracksuit and slippers and everything. Yeah, terrific. But what we're losing in corporate life, what we're losing is that sense of collegiality, which promotes kindness, but also promotes common sense. Like there are things that we won't do or say when we're in a group of other people that we might do or say when we're just doing it on a screen or tapping it out on a keyboard. You can go off at weird tangents without the correction of a little. I mean, we talk about social pressure as harmful. Social pressure is usually a very good thing. That's a corporate community or a neighbourhood or a family exerting pressure on an individual is gone off at a bit of a funny tangent. So, yeah, I think that is a real problem. The other thing about corporations as institutions, just in the context of what institutions do. I mean, I think of institutions as the scaffolding that sort of holds society together. It's not where the action is. The action is what goes on inside with people with their personal lives and relationships and marriages and neighbourhoods, all that. But we have corporate scaffolding and religious scaffolding, political scaffolding, cultural scaffolding, all those things. And institutions are like the scaffold, designed to let us get on with our lives and have rich and satisfying lives and build social harmony and all that. So a challenge for corporate Australia is not just the one we've just been talking about, which is how COVID has affected the extent to which we're going to be a human environment or a sort of techno-human environment. But it's also happened over the last, I suppose, 25 or 30 years that some corporations or some institutions, I mean, I wouldn't just say corporations, although it's been true of banks, but it's also been true of churches, it's been true of the media, where people have thought, hang on, you don't really seem to be about promoting social harmony. You don't really seem to be about supporting us to lead rich and satisfying lives. You seem to be about your own agenda. You seem to be about looking after you, preserving, protecting your hierarchy or your profit or whatever it might be at the expense of serving the community. This whole idea of corporations, institutions having a social license, we bring them into being to provide that scaffolding that protects us and secures us and makes it possible for us to get on with our lives. When we feel as though the institutions that are supposed to be the scaffold have got their own agenda, are in it for themselves, and they're not there to serve us, we get very jumpy. And that, as the degeneration of or decline of respect for politics, there's also been a decline in respect for banks, churches, media, trade unions, other institutions where people have read their behaviour as self-serving rather than serving the needs of the community that gave them their license to operate.
And you mentioned before about how, and I'm talking about specifically COVID here now,
Yep.
and how the corporate changes have, or COVID has created this corporate change, and we mentioned how it's changed. How much of that change, and we're probably too fresh out of COVID to have the statistics and the data to back this up, so I'm purely asking your opinion now.
Mm-hmm.
How much of that change has percolated down into a personal change within people with mental health and things like that?
Well, unfortunately, it has. Because people have become more social. I mean, take a step back. The number one public health issue in Australia is loneliness, ahead of obesity, ahead of any of the other things that we've thought of as public health issues. And the reason why loneliness is our biggest public health issue is because loneliness is associated with anxiety, depression, hypertension, inflammation, sleep disorders, vulnerability to addiction. Even a reduced life expectancy is now known to be one of the consequences of loneliness. Loneliness is, the risk of loneliness is increased by more social isolation, and social isolation is the result of more social fragmentation. So that was a sort of a big picture way of answering you. But yes, when we become more fragmented in the way we live and work, and when so many of us live alone, 25% of Australian households are single-person households. There's a lot of people living. It's not 25% of Australians. It's 25% of households, but still a huge, huge chunk of our population. When we get to that sort of situation, social isolation becomes more commonplace, and we all experienced. A lot of us experienced a bit of it during lockdowns. We knew we didn't like it. Because it does promote feelings of loneliness, and loneliness is really bad for us. So one of the reasons why we've got a mental health crisis, which we now commonly talk about, in fact we talk about epidemics of loneliness. We now recognise loneliness as a disease because of all those health consequences I mentioned. Epidemics of loneliness, anxiety and depression because of more social fragmentation. I mean, I don't want to go on and on about this, but it is pretty important. To put a dimension on it, the Australian Psychological Society and Swinburne Uni in Melbourne jointly conducted a national survey of loneliness pre-COVID. Now, we know it's got worse post-COVID, but pre-COVID, 25% of Australian adults reported feeling lonely most of the time. I mean, I think that's a chilling. That is the most disturbing statistic in social research that I've heard in 10 years.
It's alarming, isn't it?
25% feeling lonely most of the time, and here's a very disturbing extension of that. It's about 33%. In the case of our loneliest age group, which is the 18 to 25. 18 to 25, the most connected generation in history via social media, but the loneliest group in our society. And I think this is something, we just really have to address nationally, but also personally, individually. We have to be much more alert to people that we know of who may be at risk of social isolation.
And we're sitting in your lounge room today, and you're aware of these statistics. Surely our government's aware of these statistics, and yet even the public service isn't coming back to work. I mean, the government's allowing their staff to all work from home. It's a crazy setup, isn't it?
Yeah, it is crazy because it's losing sight of what humans are. Humans are social animals. We're coming back almost to the very first point we discussed. That's the kind of species we are. We work best when we're connected, when we congregate, when we cooperate, when we communicate. We need to be engaged with each other. You can get seduced by the idea that it's all terribly efficient and I mean, productivity went up during the lockdowns because people did work longer hours actually when they were working from home. But the price we're paying in terms of human health, mental health, loneliness, erosion of kindness is a very high price.
Take mental health out of it for a minute, and this is on a very simplistic level. We work best when we congregate, and I'm talking about the people now that are coming out of university, the younger generation that are coming into the workforce. We might work better when we congregate, but don't we learn better when we congregate?
Yeah.
Like these young people are coming out of university, they're working from home. I mean, I don't know this, but I would imagine that only a very small part of your profession is learnt in a university, and the rest of it's learnt through experience and teamwork and learning from elders and learning from people that have been on the journey. And they're not going to get any of that.
Yeah. And learning face-to-face from teachers. I mean, one of the things we know about education is that the process is at its richest and most productive when it's embedded in relationships like this, face-to-face, the teacher and the pupil, the student. There are students now graduating from our universities who've never set foot on the campus, who've done the whole thing online and with textbooks and so on.
And now they're going to work from home.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very disturbing
it's almost scary,
trend. The smart universities are now starting to address this. I mean, they've got to the stage where most lectures are available online. Okay, Well, students use textbooks. That's something they do privately. They can now access lectures online. That's something they can do privately, individually. The smart universities are now saying, okay, you can get your lectures online, but you've got to come to small group tutorials. And that's where tertiary education started, really, in the hundreds of years ago. The great universities of Europe and England, small group, intense, often one-to-one, but we can't afford that anymore. But certainly the small group, until we get our students back into small groups, working together with each other and closely, personally with their teachers and tutors, until we do that, we're hollowing out the education process. It's not a rich process anymore. It's just a kind of information that has to be absorbed, rather than a full educational experience, which can be transformative. Just acquiring a bit of information does.
18 to 25 is the age bracket suffering the worst from loneliness. Let's talk about the nastiest institution of them all, of what I believe to be social media. What social media had to do with the kindness revolution and people's ability to be kind?
Well, two things we have to say. One, we've got to acknowledge the good stuff. We've got to acknowledge that that internet-based information technology is brilliant. It's convenient. It's efficient. Does allow, for example, families or corporations or other institutions to maintain contact with people around the world who they might not be able to get to see face to face. That's all true, and it's fun. But the information technology revolution promised to make us more closely connected than ever, and it has done that in that very limited sense. It has also made it easier than ever for us to stay apart from each other, because the technology, like all this stuff we're talking about working from home, is a perfect example of it, Andrew, but it applies in social media as well, where young people in particular are exchanging a lot of their information, words and pictures, via screen-based devices. Now, does that matter? Well, you have to acknowledge how different it is to be face-to-face with someone, getting all the richness, all the subtlety, all the nuance of face-to-face connection. And back to the neuroscientists, they tell us the crucial ingredient in human relationships is eye contact. If we're not making eye contact, then we're not really connecting. And of course, you can't make eye contact on a screen. You can look at someone and you can feel as if you're looking at their eyes, but they don't think you're looking at their eyes because you look as if you're looking at the camera. It's weird. It's not eye contact based. So what happens to humans when too much of their relationship time is traded off in favour of social media? Well, there's an expert on this, a clinical psychologist and academic in Melbourne called Michelle Lim, who has coined, I think, the perfect term to describe this. She talks about social hunger. And she says the effects of social hunger are very much like the effects of physical hunger. And we know what we're like when we get hungry. We get a bit cranky, a bit irritable, even angry. Young people talk about being hangry when they're angry because they're hungry. There's some fascinating research, bit off the point, but some fascinating research done on a UK parole board, which showed that decisions made about prisoners coming before the parole board were very different before lunch and after lunch. They were much more generous, much kinder after lunch than they were before lunch. And that's what we're like. Everything, you get a bit cranky and irritable, and then you have lunch and everything feels a bit better. Well, social hunger is like that. The point that Michelle Lim is making is, unless we are getting our daily dose of eye contact, unless we're spending time physically in the presence of each other, then we're going to suffer from social hunger, and the symptoms will be similar. We'll become cranky without knowing why. We'll become irascible, abusive, even angry. Why is there so much abuse on social media? Why do some young people in particular have to come off social media because they've been bullied and abused and belittled? And the reason is that the heaviest users of social media are suffering from social hunger, and they don't even know it. They don't know why they're angry, but they're angry because the trade-off has been in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and you covered everything for there. I think that I don't want to be the one that cans social media. You've pointed out that there is some benefits to it. It certainly encourages a lack of interaction and integration into society, I think. And it creates an environment that encourages bullying, or it makes bullies feel safer.
Yes. To
be able to do things that they wouldn't do if they were
face to face.
Correct.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
And there's a couple of things. I can't steal your whole day off you, and I would love to. We've talked a bit about the book and the things that really resonate with me. Now, a couple of things that I've heard you talk about that I find fascinating, and I'll just dot point them again and lead you into it, but I'd just love to touch on them. What does this mean to you? Life is imperfect.
Yes. Yeah, this is a great learning, and the sooner we learn it, the better. Perfectionism is a form of madness because it isn't like that. Humans are not these rational beings that we like to. I mean, we call our species Homo sapiens. We're not, wise man. We're not very wise, and we're not all men. We are very imperfect because we're driven by our emotions. It's best to think of us as non-rational. Now, put a couple of non-rational people together in a relationship and it's bound to be messy. It's bound to be a bit unpredictable. It'll go through rocky patches and so on. Perfection is beyond... You won't find the perfect latte. You won't find the perfect teacher at the perfect school for your child. There'll always be human imperfections as a result of human frailty. We're all flawed. We're doing our best, but none of us achieves perfection. The only perfection is death. When you're dead, you're perfectly dead, Andrew.
I've heard you say that before.
That's something to look forward to.
The only time we're perfect is when we're perfectly dead. Yeah.
So I think learning as early as we can that perfection is beyond our reach is very healthy, because it means we're going to be more content, more accepting of what we've had, more accepting of each other's imperfections and deficiencies. I don't think it means we're going to say, I'll just settle for second best. We're still striving to do the best we can and to be the best partner, best parent, best neighbour, best employee, colleague, whatever it is. Yep, we all want to do that. But we know, built into us, is the probability that we'll fall short of perfection. But we'll still have a wonderful time, still have a fulfilling time, but it won't be to do with, now I've achieved perfection.
And we can respect and appreciate each other more.
Yes.
In the knowledge that none of us are perfect.
Yes. The cruelest thing people ever say to each other is, why can't you be more rational?
Yeah.
Answer, because I'm human.
And I'm not perfect.
Yeah.
Attack and defence and reinforcing prejudice.
Yeah. This is a big one. Just back for a moment to the idea of the mind cage. I've built that out of my experience. I've got these attitudes, these values, these beliefs, these convictions, these expectations, these prejudices. That's me. When you attack them, I will defend myself. And when I defend, because that's the natural thing when someone attacks us, whether they physically attack us or verbally attack us, the natural thing is to defend ourselves. So when people say, I want to change his attitudes about something, and then they do it by attacking a child or a colleague or someone, or a public education campaign about drink driving or whatever it might be. You attack someone's attitudes, they will defend themselves, and that's not just a nil result. When people defend themselves against an attack, they are reinforcing the very attitudes that the other person was trying to change. So when my cage is attacked, the effect of defending myself is to reinforce the bars of the cage. So if you try to change someone's mind by attacking them, you're going to achieve exactly the opposite of what you set out to do. You won't just leave them alone. They won't just be the same as they were before. They'll believe more strongly than they did before the very thing you were trying to change. So we've got to work differently with each other. We've got to work more collaboratively, more sympathetically, be more open to each other's point of view. Forget the attack. Let's work together on finding common ground.
And the final one, which I could talk about at length, because it's something that I have learned from you and reading your material, and it's not what I would have predicted the answer to be, and that's gender and kindness. Gender and kindness, you say that men and women are equally as kind, but it's a result of our influences and our lives that I would have always thought women had a kinder gene than men. That's just what I would have thought.
Yeah. There's it's a very controversial point, Andrew, and I think we're beginning to see in our culture how this is changing, because traditionally what you just said, we would have said was true. We would have said, oh yes, women are the nurturing gender. Women are kinder because they produce children. It's kind of built into them to be more caring and so on, more sensitive, all that, more protective. But I think we're now beginning to understand. I mean, there's some truth in that. But more generally, we all have the capacity for kindness. And I think part of what the gender revolution, which we're still in the thick of really, but what it's partly been about is reminding us that we're human before we're male or female or something in between, non-binary, transgender or any other point on the gender spectrum. We're human, and humans are capable of kindness, and culturally men have traditionally had that capacity diminished for them because they've been more concerned about power or competitiveness or something, and women have nurtured it more. I think the beautiful thing about the gender revolution is we're understanding we've all got this capacity. It's not about whether you're male or female, it's about whether you're a fully evolved human.
Just to move on, and I want to wrap up a couple of quick points with you. What does philanthropy mean to you, Hugh?
Philanthropy is wealthy people being truly human. You know, I don't think philanthropy philanthropy is wonderful, but we've got to get away from the idea it is some kind of exceptional thing. If through luck, hard work, a brilliant invention or some other thing, you find yourself with a pile of cash that you're never going to really need, you're not going to spend it all on yourself, then it will just come naturally to a fully evolved human that this now enables me to make a contribution to social harmony and the well-being of people in our society for whom these resources are not available unless I supply them. So, huge tick for philanthropy, but let's see it for what it is. It's kindness in action. It's wealthy people being kind.
Do you see Australia as lagging behind in the philanthropic space? And the reason I talk about this is almost 40% of Australians earning over $1 million do not claim a single dollar of tax-deductible charitable donations.
We've got a lot to learn about this, and I think that's because real wealth is now available to far more people. We've now got a wealth class. You know, we used to think of ourselves as broadly a middle-class society with a few rich people, a few poor people. There's been a huge growth in inequality in Australia. There are almost 4 million Australians who live below the poverty line. But at the same time, there's been this huge explosion in millionaires and even billionaires and a shrinking middle. So we're behaving according to the textbook, the nouveau riche, people who have not lived with wealth for generations but are suddenly wealthy are often so pleased with themselves they become self-indulgent and forget that they're human. forget that they're part of a society, and their accumulation of great wealth now enables them to contribute to this society in new ways. That's the next step. We've got to remind people who are newly rich that means they are newly they have new opportunities for demonstrating kindness and humanity.
I'm definitely not going to take us back to the start here, but just to touch on this point, it was nice to see during COVID that we saw a shift in that. The pay forward for coffees at the cafe,
yes.
the people helping other
yes.
people. It was wonderful.
Yes.
Are you hopeful for how the next generation will run the world?
I am. Yeah, they're much maligned, Andrew, but I'm not among their critics. I think we're looking at a generation. If we say, it depends which generation you talk about. The millennials, for example, who followed Gen X, who followed the baby boomers, they have been shaped by some quite different. I mean, they grew up they were kids during the major recession of the 90s. They saw their parents experience record unemployment, highest since the Great Depression. They grew up in a very competitive educational environment, a very competitive work environment. I think that's all been very good for them and for the generation now following them. My worry about the following generation is the loneliness problem, the reliance on social media. They're going to have to get over that, and we're going to have to help them get over that. But that generation ahead of them, who are now moving into their middle years, who are going to start acquiring more responsibility, assume positions of authority in organisations and so on, I think they are better equipped than the previous generation for dealing with a more turbulent, more unpredictable life, because they've lived through that kind of experience. They're the generation who have really said, keep your options open. They're the generation who've been very slow to settle into marriage, parenthood, a mortgage, or even a settled career. Because they've grown up in a more swiftly changing world, the lesson they've taken from that is nothing's forever. Don't get too committed too soon. Let's keep our options open, whether it's a partner or a job or housing or whatever it is. Now, I think they've been mocked for that, but I think that's a huge asset for them, because it's going to be a keep your options open kind of world that they're going to be living in and assuming responsibility for.
On behalf of everyone, I'd love to thank you for your time today. You've given us a beautiful insight into kindness. You've got a wonderful brain. You're a wonderful man. And I'd like to add, any man that believes that the holy trinity of our innate kindness is listening, apologising and forgiving, no wonder you're all of our grandma's heroes. Thanks, mate.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Andrew. It's been a huge pleasure talking to you.
To learn more about the art of giving back in whatever way you can, visit our website andrewpurdy.com.au and follow us on Instagram, The Hidden Philanthropist. Thank you for listening to The Hidden Philanthropist podcast, proudly presented by the Purdy Foundation.